The title that we're working to is Double Government, the Art of Commissioning Public Services. And my name is Professor Gerry Stoker. I'm a visiting professor at Canberra University. It's lovely to be visiting from the UK. I'm delighted to be here. And this is for four main reasons. The first is you've got sunshine. And I haven't seen sunshine for about 6 months, so I'm enjoying it. The second is you've got an economy, and it's kind of nice to experience a country that's still got an economy. And the third is that this is obviously the ideal time for me as an English person to have conversations with the Australians about cricket, and I'm hoping to do that after the presentations. But the main reason why I'm delighted to be here is to act as the person who welcomes Gerry Sturgess. Now, Gerry Sturgess is an adjunct professor with ANZSOG, based at New South Wales in Sydney, and he is a person who I first met about a decade ago, I think, when we were both together working on policy issues in London. And Gerry came across as the typical Australian as far as an English person was concerned, in that he was incredibly thoughtful, reflective, careful to use evidence. Oh, all right. He was also slightly opinionated and determined to get his view across. And this paper that he's presenting on double government is an absolutely fascinating discussion. I hope that you will look forward to it and enjoy it. And then what I'm going to do is present some very quick reflections after it, and then hopefully that will all be done in the space of about half an hour, and then it will be open to you to ask questions or raise comments on the discussion, so we'll hopefully get you involved in the process as well. So without further ado, let me hand over to Gerry and let him make his presentation.
Is that, you can hear me all right with that? Thank you. John Stuart Mill spent the first 35 years of his working life as an executive in the employ of the British East India Company. Essays on government and political economy were written while he was grappling with the government of India from an office in Leadenhall Street at the heart of what's now London CBD. His father, the utilitarian philosopher James Mill, had also been employed by the East India Company for many years and played a significant role in the application of utilitarian principles, which were the sort of the new public management of the day, to the government of India. From the British victory at Plassey in 1757 until the takeover by the British Crown a century later, large parts of India were governed by this joint stock corporation. From 1833, when the last of the company's privileges were removed, until 1858, its only business was the government of India, which was carried out under a legislative mandate from the British Parliament. Following the so-called Sepoy Rebellion in 1857, the British government resolved that it would take over the direct control of the subcontinent. In effect, the East India Company was to be nationalised, and John Stuart Mill, was given the task of writing the company's defence. So in 1858, he wrote 2 papers in which he criticised the centralisation, quoting, of all the functions of government in the hands of the cabinet as an ominous advance. In doing so, Mill distinguished between the government of India, which was the responsibility of the Crown, and the management of India, which had hitherto been the responsibility of the company. And he argued that British government was characterised by a constitutional principle that, borrowing terms from his critics, he referred to as double government and divided responsibility, profound structural separation of management and government. And he gave a number of other examples to demonstrate that the government of India was not the only public service where this applied. The management of the nation's lighthouses was undertaken by the Corporation of Trinity House, a not-for-profit corporation established in the time of Elizabeth I. He was actually worried that it was going to get nationalised as well, but Britain's lighthouses are still maintained by Trinity House to this day. Responsibility for the management of the railways lay with the corporations, private corporations, but within a regulatory framework laid down by Parliament and administered by the Board of Trade. And of course, after being nationalised in 1946, almost 100 years after Mill, Britain's railways are again being managed by private corporations within a statutory framework. And so it was, the sanitary administration of towns divided between the Board of Health and local authorities, education, administration of the highways, jails, criminal justice, local authorities and various other levels of provision. And the administration of justice itself was shared between a judge appointed by the Crown and a jury of citizens selected through a contestable process in court. Mill concluded there is scarcely a single department of the business of government, except the Army and the Navy, in which the authority of the Cabinet is not shared and in some degree checked by some intermediate body. And elsewhere, if the cry of double government is to prevail, none of the free institutions of this country, except perhaps the House of Commons, are safe. And we may be thankful if the principle is not applied to Parliament too. All government, except the government of one man, is double government. So my intention this afternoon is to take the cause of double government and argue for a much more profound separation between government and management of public services. The analytical framework that comes closest to Mill's concept today is that of the public service economy, developed by the American economists Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom in the 1960s and 70s. Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2009 for her work on the management of common pool resources. But this is an earlier body of work developed with her husband and a number of other colleagues in the 60s and 70s. The Ostroms argued that the public service sector can be thought of as an economy even where it isn't a market. And even where it is a monopoly, which isn't very often, it's still better to think of the public service sector as an economy rather than one vast corporation. Drawing on their own research, the Ostroms argued that the public service economy is comprised of a number of different industries: health, education, policing, water, local area police commands and so on. That these were, they're quoting from them, are subject to as great variation in patterns of organisation, in technology and in production methods as are industries in the private sector. End of quote. In a series of field studies, Eleanor challenged the widespread assumption that the economies of scale in public services such as policing were significant, that large police forces were inherently more effective. She found that smaller governmental units tended to spend more on policing than larger ones, but they also received significantly higher levels of service, which is what their residents seemed to prefer. The Ostroms argued that the public service economy was characterised by a demand side as well as a supply side, with the prospect, indeed the likelihood, of there being differences and sometimes conflict between the producer and consumer interests. In the private sector, the unit of consumption is usually one. But in the public service economy, most goods and services are consumed collectively. Governments, the Ostroms argued, might be viewed first as collection consumption units rather than as production units. Looked at in this way, it becomes obvious that the economies of scale and scope can differ on both sides of the relationship. Indeed, there is no particular reason to assume that organisational scale and scope should be the same in supply and demand. Thus, a national government might purchase from a small not-for-profit provider and a small local authority might purchase from a large multinational corporation. In the public service economy, and I'm quoting them, the market or quasi-market exists among production and consumption units rather than between suppliers and individual consumers. Once we recognise this potential, we need not assume that all public service industries will be monopolies. Indeed, we might expect public service industries to vary from highly integrated monopolies to highly fragmented industry structures with a multiplicity of suppliers serving any given area. I would argue that that is an accurate description of the public service sector, the public service economy in Australia today. Around 95% of residential aged care is provided by private and not-for-profit providers. Around 40% of hospital admissions in any one year are made to private hospitals. Around 1/3 of Australian children go to private schools. and around 20% of prisoners, to pick a core public service, around 20% of prisoners in this country are held in correctional institutions managed by private providers. It seems reasonable to conclude then that somewhere around 30 to 40% of all public services in Australia today are delivered by private and not-for-profit providers, and there seems to be a high level of comfort on both sides of the political spectrum about the existence of that mixed economy. Across that 30 to 40% where service delivery is commissioned through contracts and grants, production is already separated from collective consumption. We already have double government. My argument is that we should be benefiting, we would benefit from pursuing double government more consciously across the public service sector as a whole. Not necessarily by outsourcing, but by separating policymakers from public service managers in a much more significant way. Now, I'll unpack what I mean by that in a minute, but let me just quickly, and I apologise, it must be quick, give you a couple of the advantages of this. One, I think that I start with the assumption that producer and consumer interests are not always congruent, and if that assumption is reasonable, then it will be difficult for ministers of the Crown to simultaneously act as the agents of service users and service providers. And if ministers are to take a side, it's difficult to avoid the conclusion, it seems to me, based on democratic principles and political administrative practicality, that the people's elected representatives should primarily serve as the agents of service users. First and foremost, governments are collective consumption agents. We do find private institutions filling that role, but overwhelmingly the consumption side of the public service economy is and will continue to be dominated by governments of differing scale and scope. So it's my argument that ministers are caught in a conflict of interest, with the result that they're underinvesting in their responsibilities as agents of collective consumption and failing to hold providers, public and private not-for-profit, properly to account. I would argue that accountability would increase if governments were to fully embrace their roles as the agents of collective consumption. And I think the evidence for that emerges when you look at what happens when there is a profound separation between commission and provision, where one level of government commissions from another level of government, or when government commissions from the private or not-for-profit sectors. I think that, contrary to a lot of the hyperbole, by and large, accountability tends to increase when services are commissioned from an external provider. I have a catalogue of examples of that, contemporary examples of that, but none of the companies, contractors, will permit me to talk about their examples in public because they don't want to offend their customers. But there is actually a very strong record of that. So let me just give just a couple of very, very quick examples. Well, let me just give one example because in the interests of time. The first civil court case in Australian history was brought in July 1788 by two First Fleet convicts, Henry and Susanna Cable, against the master of one of the ships that brought them to Australia. They were suing over some property of theirs, some clothing of theirs that had been stolen on the ship on the way out. No one knew who had stolen it. Legal historians have recognised that Philip was very generous and thoughtful in suspending the law of felony attaint. These two men, this man and this woman, had been convicted of a life sentence, and felony attaint meant in England they could not have sued. They would have had no standing in the courts. Philip recognised that this settlement wasn't going to work if 2/3 of the citizens had no legal rights, and so he let them sue. What historians haven't recognised before is that if the Crown had delivered these people to Australia instead of contractors, they would have had no one to sue because the naval captains would have claimed Crown immunity. Which meant if they knew who'd stolen it, if they knew who had actually stolen it, they could have sued that individual. But they couldn't have sued the captain, the manager of this system, this ship, for running a poor system which allowed the goods to be sold. It's essentially that difference. Because they were transported by a contractor, they were able to sue. They did sue and they were successful. They recovered. Just one other quick example. The people of India could sue their government 150 years before the people of England could sue their government. And the reason for that is that the Government of India wasn't the Crown. The Government of India was a corporation and Crown immunity didn't apply. And when the India Act was passed in 1858, the rights of the people of India were preserved. The second on my list of potential benefits of double government is increased productivity. Nye Bevan, the Minister responsible for the establishment of the NHS, famously described his vision for the National Health Service by saying he wanted the sound of a bedpan dropping in Tredegar Hospital in South Wales to reverberate in the corridors of Westminster. Given the scale and complexity of the NHS even then, but more so now, and the eagerness with which medical practitioners and trade unionists rattle bedpans to draw attention to themselves, that is utter madness. It's madness that frontline service managers are not directly accountable for bedpans. It's madness that we should seek to involve the Minister's office and head office in the fine detail of day-to-day delivery. I would argue that Ministers of the Crown should be held accountable for the health outcomes of their community as a whole, for keeping people out of Tredegar Hospital. They shouldn't be asked to account for the state of the bedpans, the number of hospital beds, or the prices charged for parking cars. And yet, in Australian state politics, that is precisely what they are held accountable for. Some ministers, of course, and some policymakers want to be held accountable for bedpans because it feels easier than designing a system where you actually keep people out of Tredegar Hospital. Currently, my major research project with ANZSOG at the moment is looking at frontline delivery, and in particular, the managers of frontline public services, so hospital general managers, local area police commanders, prison superintendents, and so on. And we're interviewing, there's almost no literature on frontline management. We're, unlike the policy implementation literature, we're not coming in through the policymakers' eyes and looking down and saying, why aren't you folk down there doing what we told you to do? We're coming in from the bottom, looking at this through the eyes of the frontline manager and saying, what do you do, what's the nature of your job, and what does that world up there look like from where you are? And no one seems to have done that before. But in the scoping stage of our review, I asked the general manager of a major hospital, public hospital in Sydney, what was the difference between his world and the world of policy? And his immediate response was, my world's dirty. His world's full of people who throw up and bleed at the most unfortunate, inappropriate moments. His world is full of people who have a psychotic fit at an inconvenient time. He never has enough resources, and he knows he will never have enough resources to do the job that he and his staff feel they need to do. The world of policy, as it was conceived by the policymaker, never resembles the world as he lives it, day by day. Some of the most important work being done in the management of public services is being done in ways that attract little attention, in part because those involved are bending or breaking the rules in order to do their job. Stronger separation of commissioning and delivery would change that. Government doesn't value these people who manage frontline services. They don't pay them properly. The financial review, the woman who runs Liverpool Health District in New South Wales has a budget of $1 billion. That's a significant organisation in anyone's terms, and yet the financial review has no consciousness of her, does not write about her or her peers. Government doesn't treat her as though she is the manager of a very significant enterprise. Stronger separation of commissioning and delivery would change that. The third benefit, I would argue, is innovation. I have a game I sometimes play when speaking to public sector audiences. In fact, I don't play it much anymore because it always ends up the same way. I ask the audience to name a public service that was invented by government. Now, we've got to exclude things that require violence because the private sector and the voluntary sector aren't allowed to do that. That's government. So if we exclude that, military and criminal justice, name a public service that was invented by government. Nobody has been able to do so. Fire brigades were invented by the insurance industry, ambulances were created by a not-for-profit, St John's Ambulance was the organisation in question, probation was invented by another not-for-profit organisation. The concept of a modern police force was not invented by Robert Peel but by a reforming magistrate, Patrick Colquhoun, in partnership with the West India Merchants of London. And so it goes. Somebody suggested the NHS, but in fact which is to a considerable extent about taxation and equity. Government does equity. The private and voluntary sectors don't do equity. But the NHS model was actually built on the integrated health system of the Great Western Railway at Swindon. Somebody said town planning, that was in fact invented by Ebenezer Howard, and England's first garden cities, Letchworth and Welland, were private towns, and so it goes. One of the problems is that government tends to innovate in serial rather than in parallel. So policymakers come up with an idea, it is implemented, it is then left to operate for a period of 10 years, and then because of a change of government or a Royal Commission, there's intervention and it's changed. That is not how innovation occurs in the private sector. It's occurring in parallel with people borrowing ideas from each other. There is actually a great deal of innovation in the public service, but it's all down there at the front line. So let me just quickly then offer a framework for double government. On the supply side, governments should pursue a mixed economy with a variety of public, private and not-for-profit providers. I make no assumptions about market share. We should expect the mix will differ significantly industry by industry, as it does now. There should be no preference for private over public provision, although care has to be taken to ensure that there's a level playing field. Significant effort needs to be invested in the development of alternative models of public provision, and there are a number of, I think, very interesting examples in the UK that have emerged over the last decade that we could pay more attention to. In my view, the primary unit of provision, in the beginning at least, should be the relevant frontline service unit. Under our current system, these would be the hospitals, the schools, the prisons, the local area police commands, although alternative policy environments may well demand alternative structures. In health, for example, I think where the case mix funding is, I think, premised upon a hospital-based model, and you could well imagine an alternative model based on community, managing people in the community rather than in factories. The standard reply of those who argue against devolution of that kind is economies of scale. And my response, and I get that argument all the time, and my response all the time is to say, show me the evidence. In 30 years of involvement in public administration, I have only once had a public servant come to me worrying about diseconomies of scale. And my argument is, if you're not showing me a graph that tells me where the diseconomies kick in, then this is not a discussion about in economic terms, it's an ideological discussion. And I think a lot of the conversations that are had about economies of scale are ideological and not about economics and management. In my view, services should be commissioned from providers, public as well as private, through a formal contractual process. It is the contract for a term of, say, 5 to 7 years that will create the distance between commissioners and producers, providers. It's the contract that will lay down performance standards and create a meaningful system of accountability. And if commissioned on the basis of outcomes, it's the contract that will create room for innovation. These contracts should be commissioned on a rolling basis so that a proportion of them come up for renegotiation each year. That would have a number of benefits. It would reduce transaction costs and increase the rate at which best practices are disseminated across the system as a whole. It would permit politicians and policymakers to introduce new initiatives in a timely way, except in the most urgent of cases, but it would oblige them to introduce their initiative over a period of 5 to 7 years. Given the challenges that the public sector has with scaling up, I don't think that that's much of a constraint if we're interested in public administration as opposed to politics. In effect, this would be a system of zero-based budgeting, with providers being required to justify their right to manage the service every 5 to 7 years. One of the long-standing criticisms of public accountability systems is that they don't pay significant attention to consequences. It's not enough to identify failure, there has to be a mechanism for intervention and reform. In my view, double government is better suited to intervention, at least appropriate intervention. It remains for me to then to say something, and I'll do it briefly, about the art of commissioning, which is the other half of double government from provision. It's a term that's only now gaining wide currency in Australia, and its meaning is not widely understood. But watch this space. There's a lot of conversation going on within certainly the three governments of the three eastern states about this. In the UK, The Office of Fair Trading has described public service commissioning as including strategic needs assessment, decisions about program objectives and priorities, and design of models of service provision. In project management, the process of commissioning ensures that systems are designed and installed and that they operate according to client specifications. In the visual arts, commissioning refers to the process by which a client engages with an established artist to deliver a work of art according to broad specifications. Commissioning is a much richer concept than, say, policy development, since it includes the responsibility for systems design and service design, deliberate selection of providers and the allocation of risk, performance accountability and intervention regimes, the establishment of vehicles for capturing and disseminating best practice across the system as a whole. By allowing themselves to be drawn into the details of delivery, politicians and policymakers have neglected their responsibilities for commissioning, for acting as intelligent agents on behalf of service users. Now, lest I'm misunderstood, I acknowledge the need to be practical in services where these principles are applied, in the precise location of the fences we erect between commissioning and provisioning, in the pathways we adopt from getting from here to there, and in the rate at which change is introduced. When John Stuart Mill was questioned by a parliamentary committee about the application of double government, he replied, "My opinion, if I were to form any, would depend on the nature of the case. It all depends." Nevertheless, Mill thought that double government would be particularly useful where permanent institutions were engaged in dealing with complex issues that were beyond the grasp of the generalist. I think if he were asked today to comment on the vast range of public services governments to deliver today, he would conclude that his principle had broad application. The American political scientist Aaron Wildavsky famously said of zero-based budgeting initiatives in the 1970s, "Some butterflies were caught, no elephants stopped." I think that properly executed, double government might just be an elephant stopper. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Gerry. And obviously the first thing for me to say is there's a lot in there that I agree with. And particularly, I agree very strongly, I think, with two of your underlying arguments. One is that I do think that governments and politicians more generally have been quite poor at the art of commissioning and taking seriously that role of thinking about services and thinking about choices from the point of view of individual consumers and individual citizens. So any system that allowed them to do that in a more effective way, I think, would be a very attractive system. Secondly, absolutely 100% agree that we need to focus a lot more on the gold that is embedded in at the coalface workers that are actually directly operating public services. They understand, they engage with challenges on a daily basis. To involve them in the processes of design and rethinking the design of public services would seem to me an incredibly sensible thing. So there's a lot that I agree with, but since I'm here to debate, let me identify 4 caveats and then a suggestion of my own at the end. The first caveat, I think, probably has occurred to many people in this room already, which is that it maybe is difficult to deny, Gerry, the value of that separation between the world of politics and the world of management. But I think we'd all perhaps have some doubts about just how easily it is possible to keep those two worlds separate from one another. And that's because citizens actually have quite complex attitudes towards public services. So to some degree, they are interested in outputs, they are interested in what's actually delivered, but also many of them obsess about process as well. And it's difficult, if you're a politician, not to get caught up in the issues of process when citizens, in their role as electors and voters, are actually asking you questions about the process as much as they are about the outcome. So there's an inevitable sense in which I think politicians tend to get drawn into implementation because that separation between policy and administration is never that easy to draw. The second thing is that I think that the concept that you borrow from the Ostroms is a very important concept, but this concept of government taking on the role of being the unit for collective consumption. But I think that one of the problems I've always had with the Ostrom's work is that they move from a market analogy to a government analogy rather too quickly. And I think that although you could imagine the government performing the role of a consumer like a consumer is supposed to in the private sector, in that role as being the agent consumer of collective consumption, they inevitably, I think, end up in a rather different world. So most of us as individual consumers have more or less fixed preferences, have more or less immediate engagement with anything that we buy or purchase, have a direct sense of the trade-offs that we'd like to make. And even then, when we're engaged in the world of consuming, we recognise the complexity and difficulty of some of the choices involved. If any of you had been shopping with my wife, you'd know that that was a very complex and difficult task. But it's kind of double, triple, quadruple that when it comes to the way in which we try and make collective decisions. Because collective decisions inevitably involve the collective. They involve politics. They involve people who won this time round, but then other people who lost. The people who lost actually try and make sure they win next time round. One of the ways that they do that is by querying issues of implementation, querying issues of practice. That the whole process of politics, that defines the way in which you do the collective consumption role, is incredibly messy. And as a result, I think that inevitably politicians get dragged into a whole series of arenas that they wouldn't necessarily want to get dragged into. And I think one of the strange things about the Ostroms is that they probably never understood politics, which is a kind of weird thing to say about them, but I think to some extent true. The third caveat is over your claims about what it is the double government could deliver, and I've got a lot of sympathy with a lot of those claims. But let me just raise one caveat about the accountability claim. And that's, I think, an interesting one, but one where, in the experience of double government, you often find that citizens feel that there's a bit of an accountability gap. So, very horrible and difficult challenge in the UK over recent months has been the report on the disastrous underperformance of a particular hospital in the Midlands of England, where literally poor performance in that hospital led to thousands of patients dying unnecessarily. And there was a major report into that hospital, and what the report concluded is all of the accountability mechanisms were in place, all of the performance measures material were in place, but still the problems persisted. And what's occurred after the report was an extraordinary debate about non-accountability. So the report came out, and it turned out no one involved in managing the hospital was going to be held responsible for what had actually happened. No one involved in managing the National Health Service was going to be held responsible for what was going to happen, and sure as hell, the Minister or Secretary of State wasn't going to be held responsible for what had happened. And it actually led to a furious public row where the relatives of the people that had died said, well, who is responsible for this and who can you hold to account? And I think that that's an example of where double government doesn't necessarily automatically deliver the kind of accountability that people want. And that would imply, I think, we need to be quite careful about the way we construct accountability systems. That leads me to my final caveat, which is over the art of commissioning. And let me just give you another example. You mentioned that commissioning relies quite often on various forms of performance measurement. But you will know perfectly well, in fact, I know because you've written about it, there are various perverse incentives associated with various performance measures. One of my most favourite examples is, again, something that came up over the last few months, which is basically the police in the United Kingdom have a lot of performance measures. And one of those performance measures are related to their clear-up rates. And one of the ways you can really improve your clear-up rates is not going ahead and charging people, but actually just giving them a caution. And if you give them a caution, in effect, that takes the crime off the books, and it says that you've cleared it up and you've dealt with it. And it doesn't require a lot of fuss, it doesn't require going through the courts, it doesn't require the collection of evidence, you just require somebody to accept the caution. But they were giving cautions to people who they suspected were guilty of very severe crimes of violence. They were giving cautions to people who they suspected were potentially guilty of rape. They were giving cautions to people who had engaged in major criminal acts by any measure. And again, it's an example of how when you commission, one of the problems I think that you have is the classic, to use another bit of economic model language, principal-agent problem, where the trouble is that the performance indicators that you give to the agent can be manipulated by the agent to suggest that everything is working absolutely wonderfully, but in practice it isn't working quite so strongly. And that leads me to my suggestion, which is I think I am a fan of double government, but I want to add to double government double politics. That is, I'm all in favour, I think, of politicians leading over policy and trying to look clearly at services through the eyes of the consumer and through the eyes of the citizen. But I also think because of some of the problems over accountability, over game playing, over some of the issues about sharing information appropriately, we need another level of democratic engagement more directly at the bottom level of services, where citizens and or politicians should be much more directly involved in monitoring and engaging what goes on. And my additional suggestion to double government is that alongside double government we probably need double politics, a politics that is bottom up as well as a politics that is top down. But I want to thank Gerry again for the talk and now say this is your opportunity to raise issues with Gerry, or potentially with myself, but I hope mostly with Gerry. Okay.